The beep of the monitor kept time like a metronome in a room that had forgotten how to breathe. Sunlight carved pale rectangles across the hospital sheets. Elena Castellano lay motionless beneath the thin cotton, a fracture of bone, and a louder fracture of a life spinning into a place she had never planned to stand. Her fingers, when they moved, clenched the edges of the blanket, as if anchoring herself to whatever shore remained. Beside her, a man she had once loved stood with the practiced casualness of someone used to having the world bend to his moods. Vincent Cain's tie was loose, his cuff unbuttoned. He folded and refolded a single sheet of paper with the impassivity of a man who believed documents were more honest than people. When he set that page down on the bedside table, Elena saw the crease. It was divorce papers, an instrument meant to cut what remained of their marriage as calmly as a surgeon's scalpel. Vincent's phone buzzed in his hand. He answered it on the third ring. Elena heard nothing of the voice on the other end, only the cold threaded between Vincent's syllables. "She's a liability," he said. "If she died, it would have been clean. Now it's messy." He leaned closer to the phone, voice lower, as if confiding in another conspirator. "I can't have Castellano Holdings tied to a broken woman. It sinks deals. It scares investors." He laughed once, a small brittle sound that did not belong to the man who had once whispered promises beneath a bower of lights at their wedding reception. "No, don't worry. I'll take care of it." Elena's throat tightened. The words moved through her like a cold current, shocking rather than stunning. The monitor's steady beep became a drum. A different beat rose behind it, the pulse of calculation, not fear. She had gone into the crash certain of one thing, that life could be rearranged by a moment. She left the hospital understanding another thing. Character was revealed under the most merciless scrutiny. Vincent hung up. He tapped the divorce papers as if to convince himself of their finality. He tapped the phone to his ear, calling someone new. Elena could not yet form the words to respond, but she listened. The hospital room, so clinical, so small, held the same theater of intimacy where they had once planned their future. Now it hosted an unguarded confession. "You know what to do," he told the voice on the other end. "Move the funds. Don't leave anything traceable to us. Make it disappear before anyone notices." She had expected betrayal, perhaps. She had not expected such commodity-like talk about her existence. Each syllable burned like acid. But anger did not rise first. Instead, a cold clarity settled, sharp and precise. If he could speak so plainly in that predicate place, then her work was simple. Let him show the world what kind of man he was. If you want more stories about resilience and justice, hit subscribe. She watched him leave the room later, the door sighing closed behind him. The hallway swallowed his silhouette. The plan did not arrive all at once. It emerged from smaller decisions, each as deliberate as breath. Elena began quietly to take stock. Before the crash, there had been a life threaded with the kind of competence and privilege only a few inherit. Castellano was a name that fit both in boardrooms and at charity galas. Her father had built an empire in hospitality and tech, a latticework of hotels, venues, and enterprises, shrewdly positioned at the edge of every city's appetite for luxury. Elena had been raised on the language of ledgers and late-night negotiations. She learned to read contracts before she learned to read people. Vincent Cain had stepped into that world like a man finding a suit that almost fit. He'd had charm and hunger, both attractive commodities to a young woman who believed love should be an act of risk. He'd told stories of his own hard-scrabble origin, the way his family scraped by, the small-town humility that made him seem honest. He could be tender, he could make coffee at dawn, and carry 100 small domestic kindnesses like an offering. Elena married him because, at the time, it felt like a collision of two trajectories, her steady climb and his promise to rise. There were fractures in the marriage that first shimmered like hairline cracks, a missed anniversary that turned into a pattern, a hesitation before introducing him as my husband in the room where her father's legacy held court. The boardroom's candor sometimes found its way into their home in poisonous, small moments. "You don't understand how investors talk," Vincent would say then, as if the fault lay in her tongue. There were afternoons he would disappear to meetings he never fully described, and she would puzzle until the logic of his absence arranged itself into pattern. Natasha Williams arrived like comfort in human shape. Natasha had been Elena's friend since college, a warm laugh and an easy shoulder before she became, without anyone quite noticing, a shadow in the spaces between Elena and Vincent. She knew Elena's schedule, her taste in wine, the precise cadence of her laughter. When Elena's father's health began to fail, Natasha was there, at the hospital, delivering sandwiches, insisting on practical things that felt like love. Then came the subtle wrongness, a smile that lasted too long, a hand lingering on Vincent's forearm, text messages that blinked and then vanished when Elena was near. People who had once been simple constants became irritants. Elena did not see the affair at first. She saw the finality instead, her father's funeral, the transition of control to her, and a man whose appetite for control had grown louder with each passing quarter. After the funeral, Vincent's impatience for influence became transparent. He resented being second-guessed by her board. He called her decision to hold salary lines during a market slump sentimental in private conversations that burned her with their condescension. He wanted power, not stewardship. The old stories of a man from nowhere who had loved a woman like her had shifted into a sharper narrative. A man who wanted what she had built, and who believed he deserved it, regardless of the cost. The accident happened on a rain-slick night that read like fate. Elena was driving home from a late meeting, thoughts still on an expansion plan, and on a note she'd forgotten to send her operations director. A semi clipped her lane. Headlights threw long, false shadows. 1 second she thought she could correct it. The next she was tasting air and glass and the cruel calculus of physics. The car folded around her with an intimacy that would leave marks outside and most notably within. Her spine fractured, nerves damaged. Doctors spoke in calm, professional tones, words like stabilize, risk, prognosis, that translated into an uncertain future. The early days blurred into one another. Morphine haze, the staccato of questions from insurance adjusters, the soft intrusion of the press as rumors found a way to gossip through people who had once toasted her name. She was physically diminished in ways that mattered, and in others that the world loves to measure. She could not stand without help. She learned to let strangers hold her weight. But Elena's mind remained unbroken. If anything, the injury clarified what needed to be done. There is a certain economy to admitted weakness in a world that misreads it as advantage. She understood that the way the public, and, crucially, the markets, interpreted her situation could tilt a company's fate. If investors thought she was incapacitated in the way Vincent wanted them to, irrelevant, ruined, the ripple could cost hundreds of jobs, contracts, and the very legacy she had a duty to protect. She had been raised to believe that stewardship included more than assets. It meant people. She would not let her father's creation be plundered because of someone else's appetite. She asked the doctors to be blunt. Tell them what they need to hear, she told one physician in a voice that was small but precise. If this will keep people away so that I can make a plan, tell them that I might not walk again. The phrase landed like a stone. She did not ask for false hope. She asked for strategy. She wanted the world to believe the worst so that the worst could be contained and the truth could be managed on her own terms. Her team, those who had not been seduced by the comfort of Vincent's fast promises, assembled in a room that smelled faintly of coffee and legal ink. James Harrison, her CFO, sat with hands folded. Patricia Morrison, the head of public relations, had a stack of statements and an expression that balanced grief and strategy. David Strong, a pragmatic lawyer with a dry wit that belied his intensity, tapped a pen and listened. Robert Clean, who managed security for the family properties, and Michelle Torres, Elena's operations lieutenant, filled in the remaining chairs. They moved with the efficiency of people who knew the value of measured steps. They would not play with the law. They would not instruct falsehoods to the point of fraud. Instead, they built an ethical theater, a public narrative that would keep predators at bay long enough for Elena to safeguard what mattered. They tightened contracts, reassigned tasting dates and high-profile events, and quietly rerouted certain holdings into trust structures that could not be touched without multiple signatories and legal review. Nothing illegal, nothing reckless. Just good, old-fashioned legwork done with the kind of patience few people possess under pressure. There were practicalities that had to be managed without sensationalism. The company needed a face to reassure the market during Elena's absence, someone competent who believed in the long term, rather than the quick flip. James and Patricia spun a communications plan that would stress continuity, employee welfare, and the company's conservative stance. In public filings, the language about Elena's condition was careful enough to be truthful without teeing up a ransom note for anyone with a grudge. At the same time, Elena ordered something else, a monitor on the joint account she and Vincent technically shared. She left an operational contingency, a modest balance that would be visible, expendable, and, if taken, would reveal more about character than any court filing could. She wanted truth to be a visible thing. If he reached for those funds, she would not be surprised. If he did, the evidence would be clean. She sat through physical therapy with a patience that was both weary and fierce. Each tendon's protest was a reminder that recovery would be incremental, cruelly realistic. She learned to work a hand into a grip strengthener. She learned how to coax a knee into standing with a walker. She practiced walking in short arcs, then in longer ones, feeling humiliation and determination braided together. She sweated, cried quietly into the collar of a shirt, and then returned the next day. The world could see a woman harmed. Only a few saw the mind that refused to be broken. Outside the hospital, the rumor mill began its quiet, corrosive work. A whisper here, a friendly journalist there. Vincent fed the narrative with the competence of a man who believed the world owed him. He moved quickly. He transferred funds that were visible and convenient. He filed for divorce with a cold efficiency that carried no trace of grief. The papers called it a mutual dissolution, as if two people chose to untangle themselves with mutual respect. In private, the divorce felt like a theft disguised as procedure. When Vincent drained the account, one of several that were visible to him but not the core reserves Elena had secured, he did not consider consequences beyond his immediate comfort. He and Natasha announced their new venture with the vanity of people eager to rebrand themselves as creators of the future. Their press release was glossy, promising innovation and disruption. It did not mention the money trail or the quiet contracts that had originally seeded the funds. The new company's website gleamed. Investors, starved for the next big thing, did not ask where the seed money had originated in the race for exclusivity and returns. Elena watched the headlines with a measured silence. There was nothing theatrical in her sorrow. She felt, as the team had planned, the sting of betrayal and the steady responsibility of stewardship. She spent nights reading financial statements in a room that smelled of antiseptic and lemon cleaner, the glow of her laptop carving blue into the dark. She could not do everything, and she had no desire for sweeping revenge. What she wanted was justice, the unraveling of a false narrative, the protection of her employees, the reclamation of a legacy built with sweat and time. The theater of bankruptcy they staged was delicate. Press statements were released with the cadence of grief and fiscal caution. Patricia, adept at shaping tone without crossing ethical borders, used plumb words that encouraged sympathy and lent appropriate legitimacy to the idea that Elena's capacity to lead might be in question. Local tabloids sniffed for fresh angles. One story emphasized her fragile recovery. Another suggested a once formidable heiress had met a fall no company could easily bear. It was, in the world's eye, a decline. Elena allowed the decline to exist publicly because it served a purpose. Underneath the theater, James, David, and Michelle worked through legitimate legal avenues, trusts, board-level authorizations, and insurance instruments, protecting contracts and payroll so that the company did not actually collapse. They moved relationships with vendors, secured key accounts, and placed trusted managers in visible roles. Employees were paid, vendors were reassured. The hotels continued to operate under normal standards. The public saw ruin. The people who worked daily for the company saw continuity. That should, Elena believed, be the only reality that mattered. During those months, Vincent grew bolder. He smiled for cameras. He posed at ribbon cuttings, grinning beside Natasha in a slinky dress, his arm possessive across her shoulders. He was the phoenix in public perception, rising, reinvented. The money he'd siphoned financed glossy press kits and a hiring spree for a small exclusive team. People who had liked the surface were eager to be part of the new narrative. Money moved because optimism begets optimism. Within the fortress of Elena's remaining influence, Not everyone agreed with the slow burn of her method. Some urged legal proceedings more loudly, wanting immediate court filings, public accusations, the rapid cannons of scandal. Elena resisted. She wanted facts, not fury. She wanted evidence that could stand in front of a jury of investors and not crumble under cross-examination. When the divorce was finalized, it was as clean and clinical as the paper it sat on. Elena signed where necessary. She felt the formal closings like small cuts. A name removed here, a clause adjusted there. Vincent left the court with the same small, brittle smile. On the courthouse steps, he hugged Natasha and kissed her like a man who had just purchased a new identity. Months passed. Elena's walks lengthened. Her steps, formerly halting, found rhythm. Her board continued to hold. Castellano Holdings remained solvent at the core, where she and James had kept it so that the company could ride any storm. Robert made sure that key contracts bore protections that took time and legal scrutiny to breach. Michelle ran the hotels with the same exacting standards they had always kept. But life has a way of bending to bold events, and an envelope arrived one day that tasted like forethought and malice. The paper was thick, the print neat. It could have been any invitation, gilded, polite, but the words were sourly specific. Vincent Cain and Natasha Williams request the honor of Elena Castellano's presence at their marriage ceremony. The date was circled in a way that suggested the sender imagined the moment as a final public humiliation. The venue, printed in an elegant serif, was the Grand Marquette Hotel, a new palatial space in the heart of the city whose marble lobby and columned facade had become a sought-after backdrop for social triumphs. The irony was a small thing. The invitation suggested a warm courtesy, an assumption that she would come and be gracious. That Vincent would think himself entitled to play the final act, where humiliation could be both spectacle and closure. Elena turned the invitation in her fingers. Her thumb brushed the crest stamped lightly on the lower corner, an emblem she knew well. She knew it because the crest was the Castellano mark. She recognized the motif of the laurel entwined with a compass rose. Castellano Holdings had, under the radar of many, purchased and renovated the Grand Marquette months before. The acquisition had been wrapped in corporate language and folded into an existing property management subsidiary. The hotel's signage had been replaced with a tasteful, neutral logo months earlier to avoid scandalized headlines. At staff orientation, Robert had pointed out the building's legal owner with a casualness that had seemed a comfort then. The crew had ceded small acknowledgements in local press, the kind of sotto voce notes about an investment group revitalizing a historic hotel. No one reading the invitation would have connected that ownership to Elena. For most, the Grand Marquette would be merely a glamorous set piece for the wedding. For her, the crest had been the same one that sat on the back of her father's office chair. The discovery was not a light bulb meant for spectacle. It was a piece of geometry that made the room for a different plan. She folded the invitation without haste. It fit naturally into the sequence she had been building for months. The public fall, the private resilience, the slow reassessment of who held power. There was no joy in reading Vincent's flourish, only a clear-eyed assessment of the choice he had made. He had invited her because he wanted the optics of finality. He wanted to parade his triumph. He wanted to show the world that her ruin was complete and his ascent unquestioned. Elena called Patricia. "They're holding the wedding at the Grand Marquette," she said simply. Patricia's pause was the faintest crack of a laugh. "That's ambitious," she said. "Not everyone knows the ownership trail," Elena replied. "But we control certain aspects of the property, and the staff knows who runs things. It's unlikely they'll recognize the crest, but that's not the point." "What is the point?" Patricia asked. "To let truth be visible," Elena said. "To let those who took what wasn't theirs stand in a room they think is theirs and watch the consequences of their choices unfold without us stooping to the level of spectacle." Patricia's silence now was steadier. "You're certain you want to go?" "No," Elena said. "I'm certain they think they own the room." A small plan latched onto that certainty. It would not be a revenge play. It would not be a spectacle meant to humiliate for humiliation's sake. She would not craft a theatrics of cruelty. Instead, she would arrive at the place where she was assumed to be an irrelevance and, with evidence and composure, reveal the truth that had been concealed. She would expose what Vincent had done without shrieking morality at anyone. She wanted the facts to speak, the timelines, the transfers, the board statements that contradicted the fairy tales he sold at ribbon cuttings. There were many ways to prepare for a reveal. Elena's style was not fireworks. It was the old school of making sure the paperwork was lodged, that the witnesses were credible, that the small human truths were ready to be voiced by people who knew them. She instructed David to gather documents that could be presented to a crowd in a way undeniable to more than investors, something that even the casual wedding guest could see and take away. James was to assemble a dossier that showed the exact flow of money into the new venture. Documents that, while they would demand the scrutiny of auditors and courts, would make sense, even in a narrative told across microphones and whispered conversations. Michelle would ensure that employees who had been affected by Vincent's decisions could speak if asked. Robert would quietly confirm that the Grand Marquette staff knew who the controlling owner was and that the property could be secured for a dignified entrance. There was a line, Elena knew, between exposing and shaming. She would not cross it. She had learned in the months of recovery that power looks a certain way, not in raised voices, but in the ability to make choices without the need for spectacle. Whatever she did would be meant to protect legacy and people, not to scar vanity. The day she accepted the invitation, she did it with a quietness that unnerved some and steadied others. She would attend not to vindicate herself by sight, but to let a roomful of witnesses discover a truth on their own terms. Those who had been collateral damage, employees, vendors, the housekeepers who polished the brass railings with the same care every morning, would see that the world was not fully as advertised. Eleanor reopened her planner and circled the date. In the weeks that followed, her therapy sessions lengthened into walks through the hotel-lined streets she had once made her checklist. She met with designers to choose a dress that would not scream for attention but would fit the dignity she intended to embody. Patricia curated a short, precise statement for the press, if press became involved at the event, wording that would be calm, fact-forward, and uncompromising. David worked to ensure that any evidence presented in public would be defensible, ethically acquired, and devastatingly clear. Vincent's team, if it could be called that, continued to puff themselves up in the press. Articles lauded their vision. Interviews praised their drive. Natasha smiled for the camera in photographs that gleamed with artful exposure. Her ring flashed like a pact sealed in money and narrative. People loved a reinvention. The world loves someone who emerges from ruin to claim a brighter stage. Elena found that people extended their hands in different ways now. Some wanted to console, others to sell their loyalty. There were letters from old board members, some tender, some penitent. There were messages from line managers who thanked her for not letting jobs vanish during the months where the company's public picture looked dire. The employees who had stuck through layoffs and conservative austerity measures expressed cautious gratitude. Elena's chest warmed with the knowledge that stewardship had not been rhetoric. It had been real. When a journalist called to ask if she planned to make a statement at the wedding, Elena's answer was a small study in restraint. "I will be there as an invited guest," she said. "If anything comes up, the company will respond through official channels. My concern is for the people whose livelihoods depend on these businesses. That is where my attention will remain." Vincent, unaware of the ownership thread he had stepped into, posted photos of invitations and a glimpse of the Grand Marquette's facade. The hotel looked enormous and immaculate in his feeds. He captioned one image with a line about new beginnings, and the comments poured in. Cheers, hearts, 1,000 assumptions. Elena watched, and then she prepared. She did not tell everyone of the plan. Only those who needed to know were briefed. Secrecy was not drama, it was prudence. Robert oversaw the logistics of arrival. James prepared contingency funds for any investors who might panic. Patricia drafted a short, resolute statement and a set of facts. David assembled his binder of documents, neat and impossible to misread. Michelle reached out to managers at the Grand Marquette under the guise of checking amenities. Anodyne scheduling that doubled as a discreet check to see who in the staff remembered Castellano's crest. The staff remembered. A young concierge who had joined the hotel just after its renovation had wandered into a meeting with Elena's name on his tongue and a card in his pocket. I thought I recognized the crest," he said, voice faltering with embarrassment at the confession. He had never connected the investment group to the family name. The side channel of ownership had been small, flattened under corporate language and practical anonymity. But it existed. On a grey morning that tasted faintly of rain, Elena began to pack her own suitcase. She chose a jacket that concealed the residual bruises of months of therapy, shoes that made walking possible without dramatics. She wore no jewelry that would make the photographs scream. She put a single vial of determination into a pocket. When she left the house that morning, the driver did not ask questions. The team's cars moved in a quiet caravan, each vehicle containing a member of her small circle. They arrived at the Grand Marquette's porte cochere the way other guests arrived, discreet, efficient, yet there was a tautness under the calm. The grandeur of the hotel swallowed the smallness of any envy. White columns, a polished floor, chandeliers that refracted 100 small lights. The staff straightened as if preparing for a parade. The crest, whose presence on the invitation had been incidental, was stitched under the check-in counter. It was quiet proof that the room would not be quite as neutral as Vincent imagined. Vincent and Natasha moved through the hotel like actors used to applause. Friends clustered around them and offered toasts already written for their mouths. They believed in their own narrative with the dangerous faith of the newly triumphant. The band tuned, the flowers were set, people chatted and took photographs and confirmed with their phones what the world had already agreed to believe, that this was an evening of closure and joy. Elena paused at the foot of the grand staircase. The moment was small and luminous, an instant where everything she had been patient about waited like a held breath. She adjusted the lapel of the jacket and felt the steadiness of her hand. She was not there to explode. She was there to let truth be seen. A waiter brushed her elbow with a tray of champagne flutes and whispered that the ceremony would begin in 15 minutes. Staff moved like well-oiled machine parts. Guests laughed in anticipatory clusters. Inside the ballroom, the light came down in gentle pools. The banners and arrangements and the brass accents played their part. Guests chatted, unaware that the scene's narrative had been quietly rewritten months ago. Elena stepped into the ballroom and their heads turned. A ripple of surprise, then a hush. Some faces registered confusion, others attempted the thin courtesy of a smile. Vincent's smile faltered when his eye caught the outline of her silhouette in the doorway. The man who had called her a liability and wished for her absence found himself suddenly small in a room he had thought he owned completely. She walked toward them the way a tide moves, inevitable, not loud. She did not rush. She took the longest route, allowing people to feel the weight of her presence. When she reached the center of the room, the band paused, as if sensing a shift. Champagne stopped bubbling mid-air for several unbelieving seconds. Elena looked at Vincent. He tried a smile that did not reach his eyes. Natasha's face shifted, first a polite warmth, then something like panic. They had expected humiliation in a way that was merely humiliating. They had not expected the kind of cool exposure that treats facts like light, unyielding and pure. She had, as planned, a small set of documents filed with her counsel and copies that could be presented to any who asked. She had made contingency arrangements that would allow employees to speak about what the months had cost them and what their future would now be. She was steady. She was prepared to let the truth do its work. And then the first person in the room asked a simple question that would tilt the evening into something else entirely. Who owns the building? A guest near the back, a man who managed a string of restaurants, asked the question more out of idle curiosity than intent. Elena inclined her head and pointed quietly. Castellano Holdings. The room's architecture of assumptions began to creak. A murmur rose. Someone checked their phone. The concierge at the table, who had been trained to stay invisible, remembered the brief, confused conversation from months before and whispered the ownership to a nearby vendor. Phones lit faces like stained glass. The crest on the check-in counter, once an innocuous detail, became a detail with a backstory. Vincent's brow tightened. He walked toward the edge of the dance floor as if to intercept her, but his stride lacked the confidence it once had. The band resumed timidly, as if realizing a melody could no longer fill the room with false ease. Guests shifted in their seats. pulling out screens and searching for proof because the world has trained everyone to trust what their phones can validate. Elena had not come to humiliate, she had come to reveal. The revelation was not theatrical, it was simple. The people whose livelihoods had been at risk deserved a voice, and the hasty, half-hidden transfers that had financed a new venture needed to be seen and judged under the light of sober examination. She did not speak then. She let the ripple of recognition wash the room and allowed those who held power, the small cabal that had thought themselves beyond reproach, to feel the first drop of consequence. The moment is where we will pause, where choices intersect, and futures hush to listen. The murmur swelled into a ripple and then a wave. Phones raised like small altars, screens illuminating faces that had moments before been warm with congratulation, and now were lit by a new hunger, proof. Someone at a side table tapped a search, and a headline bloomed across a dozen feeds. An archived real estate brief, a municipal filing, a photo of a closed-door meeting signed with the same laurel and compass Elena now knew by heart. The ballroom that had been staged for joy shuddered, as if the chandeliers had suddenly learned gravity. Vincent moved first, the reflex of a man trained by careless confidence. He crossed the room with the quick, apologetic smile of someone who imagined truth was elastic. "Elena," he began, voice too loud for the lowered hum of conversation, "you shouldn't—" She shook her head, the small gesture of someone refusing a script. "I'm here to see a friend married," she said. Her voice carried, not because she meant to dominate, but because the room had grown strange and needed a human anchor. "I'm here because I was asked." He tried to seize the narrative, to turn the focus back into something he could control. Charm, jokes, a recall of their old days. But the air had already changed. Guests leaned forward like people listening for the first quiet in a storm. David rose then, quietly, from a seat where he had blended into a cluster of suppliers and groomsmen. He carried a slim binder as if it were a hymn book. The binder had a calm ribbon. He did not shout. He did not brandish evidence like a weapon. Instead, he opened it with a motion that invited attention, and when asked, offered the first clear timeline. The dates of transfers, the small signatures that connected bank accounts, the board minutes that showed a quiet reassignment of management authority to temporary overseers when Elena was hospitalized. He spoke in plain sentences that connected dots the crowd could understand. "These ledgers show seed funding that predates the startup's press release by 3 weeks," he said. "They indicate a diversion of company cash into a private venture that was represented publicly as founder-funded." A hush settled. It was not the hush of a theater ready for a reveal. It was the hush of people who suddenly realized their expectations might have been built on someone else's fervent improvisation. Vincent's face flushed. He searched the room for allies, investors he had courted with champagne and smoke, colleagues who had smiled for that glossy website. A few were there. The man who toasted him at a ribbon cutting, the woman whose lunch he had interrupted with pitches. Their smiles faltered. A young investor, cheeks still pink from excitement, leaned toward his companion and whispered, "Didn't they say that was separate capital?" His companion thumbed a phone, eyebrows drawing together as the search results matched David's calm narration. Natasha's hands were a small, frantic geography as she pressed a napkin to her face. For a moment, her public composure, trained in cameras, learned in lenses and angles, crumbled into something raw and human. She had been adept at appearing unruffled, at turning every question into a favorably framed anecdote. Now she clutched at a glass of water, lips working around words that would not come. Elena watched them both with a study of expression rather than triumph. She had no appetite for theatrical condemnation. She had an appetite for truth standing under a light. The documents in David's binder were not accusations. They were invitations to accountability. She had to be careful. Every move could be read as a move towards spectacle. She wanted no such thing. A guest stood up, a supplier whose company had lost months of payments during the political messaging that had driven the market to a pause. He cleared his throat and said plainly, "We signed a contract with Castellano last year. We lost margin because of sudden cancellations. People were laid off." His voice did not need to waver. It hollowed the room in a way that scandal never could. What mattered were not the whispered moral judgments, but the ledger lines that connected to real people's livelihoods. Phones, now frantic, continued to illuminate faces. Someone projected a spreadsheet onto the ballroom's modest screens. Patricia's touch, quick and lawful, and it made the financial story legible to an audience of well-meaning wedding guests and casual acquaintances. Line items, dates, and annotations. The web of connections tightened. The narrative that Vincent had sold in glossy interviews, heroic reinvention, entrepreneurial bravado, began to look like a rebranding funded by convenient access and exploitative timing. Vincent tried to regain the floor with a rehearsed outrage. "This is private," he said to the gathering. "You can't produce accounting like this at a wedding." "So you can," David replied, voice steady. "When the wedding is built on money that came from another company's operating accounts, people have a right to know." A cluster of investors, one by one like dam gates being lifted, muttered among themselves. The man who had been the warm face of support for Vincent's startup stood, clearing his throat. He had been photographed in an investor round that earlier this year had made the social feeds hum. He said publicly, "We're going to have to pause funding until we get independent assurance." The phrase landed like an anvil. Conversations became a fast motion of self-preservation. Phones were taken more seriously than smiles. The social proof that had buoyed Vincent's narrative sank as a few loud names. The ones whose decisions mattered pulled back. A whisper of due diligence moved like a cold wind across the ballroom. People who had shown up for cake and toasts now imagined themselves potentially entangled in legal snares they had never intended to visit. Natasha's face flushed and went pale in cycles. She had been desperate to reframe herself as the visionary partner at Vincent's side. Instead, she found herself a focal point for questions she had not anticipated. Where had the funds come from? Who had authorized them? The more she tried to answer, the less she could. Her mouth shaped alibis that sounded hollow. She had made choices that she had convinced herself were expedient. She now had to stand before a room that, with the calm pressure of revealed fact, turned whichever way justice or prudence directed. Elena did not stand at the center and deploy rhetoric. Instead, she walked to the small dais near the band where a microphone waited. She did not take it like a challenge. She took it like a duty. Her voice was clear, low and controlled. "I did not come to ruin a party," she said. "I came because a room full of people deserve the same facts I asked for when this first began." She spoke of stewardship and responsibility, of the people whose names did not trend, but whose salaries paid for mortgages and groceries. She told a short truth about the months of careful work that had kept paychecks running and properties humming while the public narrative leaned toward calamity. She mentioned, without flourish, the investments that had seeded another venture during the time when the company's visible accounts could have been insulated by a show of panic. Her words were simple, each like a stone thrown into a pond. The rings crossed one another and made circles in the room. She did not need to list everything. The documents had already begun to do that work. What she offered, neither mercy nor malice, but clarity, was the priority of restoring a fair market of action for those who had been hurt. An older man, a philanthropist who had once served on one of the hotel's advisory boards, stood and clapped once softly in approval. The sound drew a few others. It was not the raucous cheering of triumph, but the small, measured sound of people aligning themselves with candor. Vincent's expression cleaved between rage and shame. He tried to salvage the night in the only language he had, denial and distraction. He pointed fingers at vendors, implied that delays had been misread, suggested the transfers were authorized by emergency payments. At each attempt, David and James were ready with the paperwork that tracked signatures, timelines, and authorizations. The room listened, and with each document it was harder to twist the story into something that would still permit ease. The bride, who had imagined the evening as a coronation, felt the air thicken around her. Guests who had been photographed for social media smiled less freely now, their photographs likely to be revisited with new captions. Journalists in the corner, those who had come for the trends of society, not the subtleties of accounting, moved closer, sensing a more consequential angle than they'd planned. Social feeds began to populate with snippets of Elena's remarks, and within minutes a hashtag started, one that asked simply for accountability. Outside, the hotel's facade reflected a sky that had gone pale. The Grand Marquette's marble dressed the street in quiet dignity, and passers-by looked in through the tall windows at a scene transforming like weather. The staff, the same people who had polished railings and tended to linens for months, watched with a kind of relieved astonishment as a roomful of privilege discovered what their managers had quietly known all along. For many of them, the events of the evening were less about scandal and more about a looming vindication, the idea that the work they had done without public thanks mattered now in an undeniable way. As the logic of consequence began to unfold, decisions made elsewhere accelerated. An investor on the phone with a counsel excused himself and then rose. "We're withdrawing our participation until we get independent confirmation," he told those around him. It was the same phrase repeated by names in hushed clusters: due diligence, pause funding, review contracts. Vincent's startup went from a talked-about boutique project to a risky venture in the eyes of those whose capital made things happen. Under the chandeliers, where guests had planned to dance, a few chairs emptied. Small groups moved toward exits with the civil speed of people protecting interests. Natasha's smile had vanished. She kept porcelain fingers white around a glass of ice. Vincent's attempts to make jokes hit odd notes. The bravado that had once seemed real now sounded like forcing a laugh into thin air. Elena watched the unmasking with neither relish nor malice. The evening's shift had given her no pleasure, beyond the quiet satisfaction of a thing that needed doing being done. She thought of men and women who had called in sick because they imagined the leader of their company was unwell and couldn't answer the phone. She thought of staff who had been worried about layoffs. Her focus, both in the months of planning and in these charged minutes, remained on the people whose lives were tied to the company's steady course. After the initial shock subsided, the room began to reconfigure into smaller clusters, each interpreting the evidence through the lens of what it meant for them. Journalists stood taking notes. A reporter from a business outlet, face set in the kind of serious curiosity that made habits of headlines, asked a pointed question about oversight. Elena answered with the clarity she had rehearsed. Methods she and her team had used to protect key contracts and employees, the ethical line they would not cross, the evidence she had to present when people demanded the truth. The band, its music paused, started a gentle set as if hoping to lull an uncertain crowd back into easier behavior. But the notes were brittle. The rhythm could no longer smooth over the squeak of revealed facts. Guests drifted toward the exits in small knots, and the wedding, the private nonsense of ceremony, collapsed into a public recalibration. Vincent, sensing the collapse of a narrative he'd spent months constructing, shifted to Plan B, control the aftermath. He called a few allies, spoke quietly into a phone, his tone growing small with desperation. Natasha left the room with a face that had been practiced for cover stories, but now looked as if it had been scrubbed raw. Those who had been happy to be seen with them now kept a careful distance. Opportunistic reporters hovered outside the ballroom doors like predators, waiting for the scent of blood. In the hours that followed, the public reaction extended beyond the hotel's gilded rooms. Social media cherry-picked quotes and photos. Financial blogs dissected line items. A few early investors issued terse statements acknowledging they would be reviewing their positions. That kind of language, while careful, fed into an ecosystem that magnified risk. The next morning, headlines treated Vincent and Natasha's new venture as a risk story. Angel dollars paused, CEO's credibility questioned, investors seek transparency. The collapse was not instantaneous, but it was inevitable. Reputations built on convenient myths do not long survive once facts become public. For their part, Elena and her team did not launch a campaign of denunciation. They released a concise factual statement through official channels, details where appropriate, names left to the channels of law and investors' due diligence. Patricia handled media inquiries with a practiced calm, answering questions without spectacle and refusing to engage in moralizing. Our concern is continuity for employees and clients, the statement read. We will cooperate fully with any inquiries. It was measured language designed to protect the people beneath the headlines. That same day, Elena walked the corridors of a hotel she now owned openly. Staff from every department, housekeeping, food and beverage, front desk, approached her, not as celebrity or as revenge figure, but as the person who had kept their jobs. They offered quiet thanks. Some cried. One young manager, who had weathered the stress of staff cutting, held out a small card with a shaky note. "Thank you for not letting us be the collateral." Elena accepted it with both hands, feeling the weight of small human trust more than any headline could give her. There were legal motions on multiple fronts in the next weeks, not Elena's doing, but the natural consequence of funds moved under unclear pretenses and investors who wanted clean books. Investigations moved at the predictable pace of bureaucracy coupled with public pressure, some swift, some slow. Elena's team supplied documents and answers to auditors. They cooperated. They insisted on the ethics of their own actions. They made clear the difference between protecting a company from predators and committing wrongdoing. Vincent, whose bravado had once been his currency, found that currency devalued. Investors, cautious and practical, withdrew or paused support. The startup's website dimmed. Partners sought distance, as is the nature of markets. Natasha, whose social life had been a crucial backbone of their publicity, found herself increasingly isolated as old acquaintances reconsidered the social calculus of association. She gave a few interviews that tried to frame the matter as a misunderstanding. The interviews read as fragile attempts to reconstruct a narrative that no longer fit the facts. Elena never sought to press the exact point of retribution in public. She declined to castigate. She preferred a route consistent with the stewardship she had always promised. She did, however, stand in boardrooms where investors had once questioned her capacity and calmly presented proof of contracts, payroll continuity, and the ethical choices that had kept hotels staffed and vendors paid. Where her detractors had imagined ruin, she offered a steady management plan. Where confidence had been shaken, she offered sober leadership. In private moments between meetings, she sat for rehabilitation exercises and for strategy sessions in equal measure. Her walking grew stronger each week. She still felt the ache of the accident in the mornings and the fatigue of increased travel and scrutiny in the evenings. She did not present her recovery as anything divine, only hard-won muscle memory and the patience of repeated steps. She kept appointments with therapists, attended board meetings, and occasionally stopped at a staff cafe to listen to someone's week. It was in those small, mundane interactions that she felt the deepest repair. Not the public vindication, but the sense of being a steward, present and accountable. And, over the months, the legal and financial consequences tightened like a net around those who had acted in haste. Institutional investors initiated formal reviews. Questions were asked in offices and deposited in record. Certain contracts that had been premised on the startup's supposedly independent funding were renegotiated or collapsed. Vincent's new company struggled to find a footing without steady capital and with reputational doubt at its core. That was not Elena's doing in the terms of personal vengeance. It was the natural pruning of business relationships, where trust and transparency are the base currency. Natasha, in the quieter hours, faced calls from former friends. A few reached out with concern. Others offered the sort of thin-eyed sympathy that is itself a kind of judgment. She attended meetings with counsel and tried to craft a new professional path. In a city that favors reinvention, sometimes people are forgiven. Sometimes the memory of a misstep is a hole that cannot be easily filled. Her social calendar dimmed, her invites reduced to polite inquiries. She had her own work to do: ethical recalibration, private repairs, possibly the slow, grinding task of earning trust again, if that was possible. Vincent attempted once to approach Elena outside a meeting, to find a quiet place to speak of the past, in the soft tones of an ex-lover asking for clemency. Elena listened without interruption. When he asked for forgiveness, she considered the word carefully. Forgiveness, she understood, was not a magic eraser. It was a choice and an ongoing process, not a simple pronouncement. She told him she would not stand in his way of seeking to repair whatever it was he had broken, but she would not be manipulated by performative repentance. She asked only that he understand the cost of his choices to real people beyond his self-regard. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. In the end, what had once been a private act of theft, if theft was the correct moral word for moving funds in ugly timing, became a public lesson in the difference between appearance and substance. Markets, which respond to facts and figures, reacted with a cold, rational efficiency. People who had been collateral damage received the protection they needed. Employees who had once feared for their livelihoods now felt the company's leadership more present. Vendors who had been left with unpaid invoices began to get compensated as audit processes sorted first claims. Elena did not crow. She did not turn the moment of vindication into a festival of public shaming. Instead, she continued to do the work she had always done, meeting managers, walking hotels in the pre-dawn when the only voices were the clatter of breakfast staff arranging service, listening to complaints and solving problems. She knew the difficult truth of stewardship. It is often quieter than the spectacle, but vastly more consequential. Months after the wedding, there were small, concrete victories that readers of headlines rarely notice. A maintenance team that had been on the verge of furlough returned to work with steady hours. A small vendor received a back payment and wrote a note that arrived in an envelope stained with coffee. "We can keep our doors open because you intervened," it said. An assistant manager who once worried about supporting 2 children found a transfer into a role with better hours. These were not the moments that made for glossy social posts, but they were the moments that composed a life. Elena still felt the ache of the accident. Some nights she sat by a window and watched the city lights, thinking of all the small moral calculus that had become her life's work. She thought of patience, how often injustice insists itself first in the private dark, before revealing itself under light. She thought of dignity, how difficult it is to keep one's composure when every cell in your body wants to shout. She thought of justice, which she pursued not as an end in itself, but as a means of restoration for people who depended on the work she had inherited. There were invitations to speak, occasional interviews that asked for a neat moral. She refused most. When she did speak publicly, she told the truth with a measured cadence. That character shows itself in crisis. That economic stewardship means considering the lives behind the numbers. That protection of legacy is not about ego, but about duty. She emphasized that her actions had been guided by counsel and by the desire to protect employees and clients. She avoided a triumphant arc in her recounting. She refused to make a tale of private pain into a morality play for applause. Sometimes at night, she would visit a hotel lobby and stand where tourists and business travelers passed. She liked observing the small choreography of people's lives, someone on a first trip, an elderly couple holding hands, a team on a conference call. These scenes replenished her. They reminded her why hotels had mattered to her father, and why his legacy had been worth defending. It had not been about money alone. It had been about the architecture of people's lives, weddings and funerals, first steps and final goodbyes, small celebrations in hotel dining rooms, and quiet breakfasts after long nights. Those were the things she had been entrusted to protect. She kept a modest routine. Mornings sometimes began with physical therapy and ended with late-night calls. She took time to write notes to employees who had been particularly loyal. She reserved one evening a week to meet a group of managers in a humble conference room with coffee and stale donuts, a ritual more about presence than spectacle. The team that had supported her in the hospital now sat around a table that had become less about strategy and more about stewardship. When a small group of board members once asked if she planned to publish a memoir or to launch a speaking tour, she smiled. "I'm more interested in rebuilding a company that honors the people who work there," she said. It was not self-flattery. It was a statement rooted in the months of careful work that had preserved jobs in the face of greed. Time, that slow, steady instrument, did its quiet work. Vincent's name dimmed in business circles as caution took the place of curiosity. Natasha, who had once been prayed over by the tabloids as the next social star, learned the hush and the long, honest work it takes to be trusted again. Eleanor's life continued, filled with the small daily tasks of leadership, contracts read meticulously, people listened to without the trappings of power. There were days she felt fatigue, aching limbs, weary patience. There were nights she went home and allowed for a small private grief at all that had been lost, not wealth, but the ease of being naive, the loss of a marriage, the knowledge that trust could be so cheaply traded. There was mourning for the version of herself who had believed that love and stewardship would not collide with such pain. Still, she would sometimes stand on the balcony of a hotel and watch as a ballroom below hummed with life, a rehearsal dinner or a company holiday party, and she felt something steady. In those lights, she saw purpose. She saw the ripple effect of decisions made carefully under pressure. She saw the small ways in which dignity, exercised consistently, can outlast a spectacle. On one clear afternoon, months after the wedding, Elena visited a softly lit room where a small group of employees had gathered to celebrate the reopening of a refurbished wing. She walked among them, hands extended, listening to their stories about the months when simmers of doubt had been constant. She thanked each person who came forward. A few asked awkward questions about the past, and she answered with the frankness that had become her hallmark, not the excusable slip into bitterness, but the honesty that asks people to learn and to do better. A young housekeeper, who had been there during the worst months, pressed a small strip of paper into Elena's palm. "We thought we might lose everything," she said. "We thought it'd be the end." Her voice trembled. Elena, who had once listened to a man wish her dead as if it were a business problem, listened now to a woman who feared losing her rent. For that quiet exchange, more than any public vindication, Elena felt the long hours of therapy and strategy worth it. Looking back across the arc of the story that had unfolded, there were a few immutable truths Elena kept in a small private list. First, character reveals itself under pressure. Second, stewardship is work that demands humility and the perseverance of small, often invisible decisions. Third, justice is best administered through facts and restraint. Spectacle can produce headlines, but rarely heals the injured. She did not pretend the cost had been small. It had taken time, and it had taken parts of her heart. It had required a transformation from someone who imagined love as uncomplicated to someone who knew how to balance tenderness with the hard-headed care of leadership. It had required the acceptance that some relationships, once ruptured by betrayal, cannot be reduced to a simple apology. Still, there was recovery. Not miraculous, but real. It came as the slow return of steps without pain, as the restitching of a life around the bones of experience. It came in the morning sunlight that found her walking through a hotel lobby without a limp in her soul. It came in small thank you notes and in the sound of a staff meeting where the conversation was about service and not survival. On an evening when the city had a certain clarity, cool air, bright stars, Elena sat by a window and considered how the world had watched the wedding, where she had been mocked and then surprised. The event had been less about revenge and more about illumination. In that illumination, people had made choices, some seeking to mend, others to cover, many simply aligning with the fact that transparency matters. When a young journalist asked her months later whether she harbored anger, she said the truth. Anger, she said, is a tool. It can be useful when it is turned into action that protects people, but living in anger is a cage. She paused. I chose to act so the people who depend on this company wouldn't be collateral. I chose to act because I believed in the dignity of the work we do. There's no glory in ruining someone. There is responsibility in ensuring that what we build can weather storms. Her final public note on the matter was the maintenance of an ethic. Do not confuse exposure with revenge. Let facts operate. Protect the weak, not because they will reward you, but because it is right. She closed that chapter of her life not with a shout, but with a gathering. She invited a small group of employees to a luncheon and listened as they told her what mattered to them next. Predictable hours, a dependable benefit program, training opportunities. Elena wrote notes and promised to act not for headlines but for a steady improvement that would matter in people's pockets and hearts. As for Vincent and Natasha, life moved them forward in ways that demanded their own reckonings. For Vincent, the loss of steam in his ventures required a re-evaluation of motives. For Natasha, the isolation demanded reflection. They had enjoyed the ease of a narrative that allowed them to be other than they had been. The consequence taught them that the market and the human community eventually insists on truth. In the end, what remained with Elena was not the headline, nor even the satisfaction of having been right. What endured was the knowledge that patience, when married to principle, is a powerful thing. To sit quietly while the world made assumptions required a certain steel. To stand up afterward and ask only for justice rather than vengeance required something gentler still. She tacked a small card to her office wall, an old business card given to her by her father years ago. The ink faded, but the message clear. Build for people, not for show. She read it sometimes when the night was long and the work piled. It reminded her why she had not chosen spectacle and why she would not choose it now. If this story touched you, if you believe in quiet courage and justice served by truth, leave a comment and tell us which moment mattered most to you. If you want to hear more stories of resilience and restored dignity, subscribe and stay with us for the next one.